There is a place tucked away in the forests of Oregon where the ordinary rules of reality bend and sometimes break entirely. The town of Gravity Falls sits in a valley surrounded by ancient pines, and beneath its quiet surface, something strange has always been stirring. For decades, perhaps centuries, this small corner of the world has been a magnet for the impossible, the unexplained, and the otherworldly. The paranormal events that have unfolded here form a tapestry of mystery that spans generations, each thread connecting to create a picture of something vast and incomprehensible. The story of these events begins long before any living resident can remember. The very ground of Gravity Falls seems to pulse with an energy that defies measurement. Based on documented incidents in the journals, instruments brought to study the area behaved erratically, compasses spinning without reason, and readings suggested the laws of physics themselves were negotiable here. Ancient symbols carved into stones throughout the area hint that earlier inhabitants may have recognized something unusual about this place, marking locations that seemed significant, though their exact meanings have been lost to time. These symbols appear too deliberately placed to be coincidence, suggesting generations of people noticed the strangeness and left warnings for those who followed. When settlers arrived, accounts from that period suggest they noticed unusual occurrences immediately. Historical records, though fragmented, describe animals behaving oddly, sometimes growing larger than typical for their species, or exhibiting behavior that seemed unusually intelligent. Livestock would occasionally be found arranged in perfect circles, unharmed, but clearly moved by something with apparent purpose. Travelers reported losing time while walking through the forest, emerging to find the sun in a different position than seemed possible for the duration they believed they had walked. Strange lights flickered between the trees at night, colors that witnesses described as unlike any they had seen before. Some people vanished entirely, leaving behind only their belongings and stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The modern documentation of Gravity Falls paranormal phenomena began in earnest several decades ago when a researcher arrived with scientific equipment and an open mind. This person, whose identity would later become central to the town's mysteries, started cataloging everything. Every odd footprint in the mud, every unexplained sound in the night, every creature that shouldn't exist but somehow did. The result was a series of journals, leather-bound volumes filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and warnings. These journals would become guides for those who followed, maps to navigate the impossible. The first entries described the basics, the foundational weirdness that permeated everything. Trees that grew in spirals, their bark forming patterns that hurt to look at too long. Mushrooms that glowed with their own light, arranged in fairy rings that seemed to appear overnight. Water that flowed uphill in certain streams, defying gravity, as if the name of the town itself had granted permission. Rocks that hummed when touched, resonating with frequencies that made teeth ache and skin prickle. These were the small oddities, the everyday strangeness that locals learned to accept as normal. But beneath these surface peculiarities, something deeper seemed to be present. The forest itself appeared to possess qualities that went beyond normal ecology, though whether this represented actual consciousness or simply the cumulative effect of so many anomalies remained unclear. It gave the impression of watching, of remembering. Rangers who worked in the area longest spoke quietly about how the woods seemed to have moods, days when the trees appeared to lean in closer, when the silence grew so complete it felt like being underwater. On those days, Experienced outdoorsmen recommended staying on marked trails, avoiding clearings where the grass grew too green and the air tasted subtly wrong. The forest seemed to operate by rules that were unspoken, but gradually understood by those who spent enough time within it, and breaking these rules appeared to invite consequences. Among the trees lived creatures that should not exist. The first encounters with these beings were startling, though in retrospect, they represented only the beginning. Small humanoid figures with pointed hats and long beards emerged from beneath roots and stones, creatures made of earth and ancient wood. They spoke in chorus, their voices blending into a single purpose, and they followed old customs that predated human memory. These gnomes had kingdoms underground, complex societies with hierarchies and traditions. They were generally harmless unless provoked, though their definition of provocation was not always clear. They treasured certain stones, certain times of day, and they took offense at insults to nature in ways both petty and profound. Higher in the mountains, in caves that required courage to enter, lived beings of a different sort. Half man and half something else entirely. Muscular and proud, these manotaurs embodied an ancient ideal of masculinity taken to its extreme. They tested those who sought them out, demanding displays of physical strength and what they considered manly behavior. Their challenges included tests of pain endurance, raw power, and the ability to roar impressively. They kept their own counsel, rarely venturing down to the town below, content in their mountain realm where they lived by codes that valued brute force above all else. The forest floor itself harbored dangers more subtle. Creatures whose very nature appeared to be remaining unseen lurked behind trees, always positioned just at the edge of vision. These hide-behinds, as they came to be known, moved when backs were turned, following hikers with what seemed like patient persistence. They occasionally left signs of their presence in arrangements of sticks and stones that formed shapes with unclear meaning. They never attacked directly, merely observed, but their attention carried a weight that made skin crawl and sent people hurrying back to safety. Some theorized they served as guardians of some kind, watchers ensuring certain boundaries were not crossed, though this remained speculation based on their behavior patterns rather than any confirmed understanding of their purpose. In the deeper woods, where sunlight struggled to reach and moss covered everything in a thick green blanket, stranger things dwelled. Creatures assembled from forest debris, animated by something that was not quite life, but not quite magic either. They shambled on legs made of branches, saw through eyes of knotted wood, and their minds were alien, if they had minds at all. Encounters with these beings were rare and usually brief, as they seemed to exist in a different tempo than regular life, moving slowly and deliberately toward purposes only they understood. The waters around Gravity Falls held their own mysteries. The lake, deep and cold even in summer, rippled with more than wind and fish. Legend spoke of something vast dwelling in its depths, a creature so old it had been there when the valley first filled with water. Sonar readings showed impossible shapes, masses that should not be able to move as they did. Occasionally, late at night, witnesses reported seeing a long neck breach the surface, water streaming from scales that caught moonlight, before disappearing again with barely a ripple. Whether this was one creature or many, whether it was natural or something else entirely, remained a question without answer. Smaller streams and waterways held their own mysteries. Strange movements beneath the surface suggested life that did not match known fish or amphibians. Fishermen occasionally reported catching creatures with too many eyes or limbs arranged in unusual patterns, though these specimens rarely survived long enough for proper documentation. The water itself sometimes behaved oddly, flowing in directions that seemed independent of gravity or terrain, as if following paths determined by forces beneath perception. Underground, beneath the town itself, networks of caves twisted in configurations that made no geological sense. Spelunkers who ventured into them found chambers that should not fit in the space available, passages that seemed to change position between visits, and evidence of occupation by something intelligent but decidedly not human. Symbols covered certain walls, painted or perhaps burned into the stone, forming chains of meaning that resisted translation. Some of these caves connected to basements and foundations, creating pathways through which things could move unseen beneath the streets. The paranormal was not confined to living creatures. Objects in gravity falls had a tendency to become more than they should be. Old electronics sometimes flickered to life when they should have remained dormant, displaying images that did not match any known broadcasts. Mirrors occasionally reflected scenes that seemed displaced in time or space, showing rooms and configurations that did not match their surroundings. Whether these were glimpses of other dimensions, echoes of past events, or simply tricks of perception remained unclear. These unusual items accumulated in certain places, drawn together by whatever force governed the town's strangeness, creating pockets where reality felt particularly thin. Wax itself proved to be a substance with peculiar properties in Gravity Falls. Figures molded from it and displayed in certain conditions took on an eerie quality, as though the act of shaping them into human forms allowed something to seep in. One documented incident involved wax sculptures that appeared to move on their own when unobserved, suggesting they had developed a kind of primitive awareness. The figures seemed to resent being treated as mere displays, and when neglected or disrespected, they organized in ways that indicated purpose and planning. Heat made them retreat, their forms losing cohesion, but in cool darkness they could maintain shape and perhaps even agency. The dead did not always rest easy in Gravity Falls. The boundary between life and death seemed more permeable here, like a curtain that occasionally lifted. Spirits walked, some aware of their state, and others seemingly trapped in loops, replaying moments from their lives without apparent awareness that anything had changed. The oldest presences had lingered so long they had become integrated into certain locations, as much a part of the landscape as the buildings they haunted. One documented spirit inhabited an abandoned convenience store, tied to the building through circumstances that remained mysterious. This presence manifested most strongly when the store was disturbed, particularly at night. It could manipulate objects, sending items flying across aisles and creating temperature drops when agitated. The spirit appeared as a translucent figure, visible enough to be recognized as human-shaped, but clearly not among the living. Its emotional state seemed to dictate the intensity of its manifestations, suggesting it retained some aspect of human feeling even in death. Category 10 ghosts represented a different class of specter entirely. These were not mere echoes, but powerful entities capable of directly affecting the physical world. One such spirit haunted a grand mansion, bound there by a curse rooted in betrayal and broken promises. Long ago, the family who built the mansion had pledged to open their home to the common people during times of crisis. When a mudslide threatened the town, they instead barred their gates, leaving desperate families outside in the cold. Among those who died that night was a lumberjack whose anger transcended death, transforming into supernatural force. The ghost's power grew with each anniversary of the betrayal, manifesting in increasingly dangerous ways. It could manipulate the mansion itself, turning the building into an extension of its rage. Most terrifying was its ability to transform living beings into wood, petrifying them like the trees the lumberjack had once worked with in life. This curse could only be broken through genuine remorse and meaningful action, requiring a member of the family to acknowledge the wrong and open the mansion's doors as had been originally promised. The breaking of such a curse demonstrated that some spirits sought not destruction but justice, their hauntings driven by legitimate grievance rather than mere malevolence. Not all encounters with the dead proved hostile. Some spirits retained enough of their former selves to interact almost normally with the living, though the experience remained unsettling. These presences could hold territory, maintaining watch over specific locations and responding to those who entered with curiosity rather than aggression. The variety of spectral encounters suggested that death in Gravity Falls did not lead to a single fate, but rather to a range of possible afterlife states, each determined by circumstances that remained mysterious. Among all the paranormal entities in Gravity Falls, one stood apart in terms of power and danger. This being existed primarily in the mindscape, the realm of dreams and consciousness that lay adjacent to physical reality. It appeared as a simple geometric shape, a triangle with a single eye, limbs thin as lines, and a top hat that suggested a mockery of civility. But this form was merely how it chose to present itself to limited minds. The entity called itself Bill Cipher, and those who encountered it in dreams quickly learned that its cheerful demeanor masked intentions that were ancient and cruel. It desired nothing less than to break free from the mindscape's constraints and reshape physical reality according to its chaotic will. Bill's first contacts with the waking world came through dreams. It could enter sleeping minds, manipulating the dreamscape into whatever form served its purposes. The entity offered deals, always deals, presenting bargains that seemed reasonable at first, but inevitably led to larger commitments. Those who agreed to its terms, sealing the arrangement with a handshake even in dreams, found themselves bound by agreements that carried real consequences in the waking world. The nature of these deals varied. Sometimes Bill wanted information, sometimes physical access to objects or places, and sometimes it simply enjoyed the act of manipulation itself, collecting debts to be called in later. Bill's ultimate goal required breaking through from the mindscape into physical reality. For this, it needed a specific gateway, a rift between dimensions that would allow it to cross over completely. The entity was patient, working across decades to manipulate events and individuals toward creating what it required. It planted ideas in dreams, whispered suggestions to those vulnerable to its influence, and waited for humans to build the doorway it needed. The demon understood psychology deeply, knowing how to exploit loneliness, ambition, and desperation. And it used this understanding to orchestrate circumstances that would eventually serve its purpose. Bill's realm existed in a space between minds, accessible only through specific mental states or powerful psychic techniques. It was a place where the normal laws of physics held no sway, where thought shaped reality and reality itself could be reshaped at will. The demon ruled there with absolute authority, able to manipulate the environment completely to reflect its chaotic nature. Visitors to this realm found themselves at severe disadvantage, unable to trust their senses, as Bill could create illusions indistinguishable from reality. Physical confrontation with the demon in its home realm was nearly impossible. It could rearrange space, create false versions of people, and manipulate perceptions so completely that visitors could not trust their own senses. Time dilated and compressed randomly, minutes passing in the real world while hours or days elapsed inside. The only defense was mental discipline, maintaining awareness that nothing seen was necessarily real, that the demon's domain was constructed from lies designed to confuse and entrap. Time itself behaved strangely in Gravity Falls, even before anyone tried to manipulate it deliberately. Certain locations experienced temporal anomalies, pockets where clocks ran backwards or stopped entirely. A clearing in the forest had days and nights that did not match the surrounding area, the sun setting and rising on its own schedule. People who spent time there aged faster or slower than they should, emerging to find more or less time had passed outside than they experienced within. These natural time distortions created ripples, small paradoxes that had to resolve themselves, usually in ways that left witnesses confused and uncertain about what they had seen. When time travel was attempted through artificial means, the consequences proved dramatic. A device from the distant future, brought to Gravity Falls by a time traveler named Blendon Blandon, allowed its users to move backward and forward through time. The wielder of such devices could create new timelines with each journey, duplicating themselves and generating paradoxes that threatened causality itself. During one documented incident, the misuse of time travel capabilities caused dinosaurs to appear in the present, historical figures to be pulled from their own eras, and the careful progression of cause and effect to become tangled beyond recognition. The time travel incidents revealed something crucial about Gravity Falls. The town existed at a convergence point, a place where temporal lines crossed and recrossed. This made it easier to access other times here than anywhere else, but it also meant the town accumulated temporal debris, echoes of things that had happened or would happen or might have happened. Occasionally, these echoes became visible, phantoms of possible futures walking the streets for moments before fading back into unreality. Time anomalies in Gravity Falls extended beyond travel to include loops and distortions. One particularly significant incident involved a day that repeated endlessly, with events cycling through the same pattern over and over. Those caught in such loops often had no memory of previous iterations, going through identical motions without awareness that they had done so countless times before. Breaking free from temporal loops required recognizing the pattern and making different choices, decisions that could cascade into genuine change and release from the cycle. These temporal events left marks on the town's fabric, creating weak points where time occasionally stuttered or moved at slightly wrong speeds. The phenomenon of time anomalies attracted attention from distant futures. Agents whose job was to maintain temporal integrity arrived to repair damage, armed with technology that seemed like magic from a current perspective. These time cops operated under strict protocols, but they could be bargained with, tricked, or occasionally befriended. Their presence confirmed that Gravity Falls was known across multiple timelines as a crucial location, a place where the fate of reality itself could be influenced. Shape-shifting creatures presented a particular challenge because their very nature was deception. Deep in an underground bunker, sealed away by a researcher who recognized its danger, lived an entity that could assume any form it witnessed. This creature possessed no stable shape of its own, existing as a mass of pale, mutable flesh that could rearrange itself into perfect copies of whatever or whoever it observed. It could replicate a person so completely that voice, mannerisms, and even apparent memories seemed authentic, making detection nearly impossible without careful scrutiny. The bunker where this shapeshifter was contained had been built specifically to hold it, with walls of reinforced metal surrounding a central chamber where the creature had been frozen in cryogenic suspension. When the bunker was eventually breached and the creature freed from its frozen state, it immediately began cycling through forms, testing which would prove most effective. The entity could speak with any voice it copied, using words as weapons to create doubt and paranoia among those trying to contain it. Combat with a shapeshifter was complicated by the fact that it could become anything in an instant. Attacking it meant potentially harming someone it was impersonating. It understood this and used mimicry strategically, becoming those its pursuers cared about to stay their hands. The creature seemed to take pleasure in the confusion it caused, laughing with borrowed voices as it turned loved ones into sources of fear. Only by forcing it into extreme cold, replicating the conditions of its original containment, could it be stopped. The shapeshifter was not unique in principle, as other entities in Gravity Falls demonstrated transformative abilities, though usually more limited in scope. The variety of shape-changing phenomena suggested this was a recurring feature of the town's paranormal landscape, perhaps related to the same forces that made reality itself more mutable here than elsewhere. Animated wax, already unusual in its ability to move, occasionally demonstrated even stranger properties. When wax figures took on life, they seemed to absorb something of what they represented, creating entities that existed in the uncanny valley between object and being. These figures moved with jerky motions that suggested their material nature fought against their animation, and they appeared to possess awareness of their own unusual state, which made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous when they felt threatened or disrespected. Body swapping represented another form of transformation, though achieved through an enchanted object rather than shape-shifting ability. A particular carpet, decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, possessed the power to exchange consciousness between people who stood upon it. This swap was disorienting and complete, placing each person's mind fully into the other's body. The exchange could be reversed only by both parties standing on the carpet again and performing the same action that triggered the initial swap. The carpet's origins remained unknown, but its existence suggested that consciousness in Gravity Falls was less firmly anchored to physical form than in other places. The lake that dominated the landscape near Gravity Falls contained mysteries beneath its surface. Witnesses over the years had reported massive shapes moving in the deep water, a creature or creatures that defied easy explanation. The most famous of these was known locally as the Gobblewonker, supposedly an ancient lake-dwelling beast with a long neck and humped back. Sightings occurred during storms, or in the quiet hours of dawn when mist covered the water, making clear observation difficult. Photos existed, but were invariably unclear, taken from too far away, or at angles that prevented definitive identification. At least one mechanical version of a lake monster was confirmed to exist, constructed by an eccentric inventor who lived near the water's edge. This robotic creation, built from scrap metal and powered through ingenious engineering, could swim and submerge convincingly enough to fool casual observers from a distance. The inventor used his creation to generate excitement and mystery, seeking attention and perhaps attempting to revive tourism. Whether the mechanical Gobblewonker was built to imitate a real creature, or whether all sightings could be explained by this fabrication, remained a matter of debate among those who had witnessed something moving beneath the waves. The lake's ecosystem included other oddities. Fish occasionally caught by locals had extra eyes or fins arranged in strange patterns. Some exhibited bioluminescence, glowing in colors that hurt to look at directly. The water itself tested clean, but had a quality that made it taste strange, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong in a way that discouraged drinking. Swimmers reported a sensation of being watched when diving deep, a feeling of vast attention focused on their small bodies invading an ancient space. Islands in the lake hosted their own mysteries. Some could only be reached during certain conditions, and those who visited found evidence of past habitation, structures, and artifacts that suggested people had used these isolated locations for purposes that remained unclear. The ruins found on various islands were carved with symbols matching those discovered in caves and buried throughout the region, suggesting connections between different sites and perhaps a unified purpose behind their creation. Subterranean mysteries ran throughout the area beneath Gravity Falls. Natural caves were extensive enough, but they connected to artificial tunnels, mines, and bunkers that created a labyrinth beneath the town. These underground spaces served various purposes over the years. Some were laboratories where secret experiments took place. Others were storage for dangerous artifacts. A few seemed designed purely as prisons, cells reinforced beyond any normal need to contain something that could not be allowed to escape. The deepest levels reached into strangeness that defied easy categorization. Chambers existed there that seemed to predate human construction by thousands of years. The walls were smooth in ways that suggested advanced technology, or perhaps geological processes unknown to science. Symbols covered every surface, glowing faintly with their own light, pulsing in patterns that almost resembled communication. Equipment brought into these deep chambers malfunctioned. Batteries drained instantly, and compasses spun uselessly. One particular laboratory hidden underground had been the site of dimensional research conducted decades earlier. The scientist who worked there, Stanford Pines, had been attempting to understand the fundamental nature of reality itself, seeking to map the boundaries between dimensions and potentially create a gateway between them. His research combined advanced technology with theoretical physics that pushed beyond accepted scientific boundaries. The experiments ultimately went catastrophically wrong, opening a portal that pulled Stanford himself through into another dimension, leaving the gateway unstable and dangerous. The portal was constructed using technology that seemed impossibly advanced for its era, suggesting Stanford had access to knowledge or assistance beyond conventional science. Its stated purpose was to create a stable doorway between dimensions, allowing observation and potentially travel to realms that existed parallel to normal reality. These other dimensions varied wildly based on what little was recorded about them. Some were physical spaces with alien landscapes and their own laws of physics, while others seemed to be more conceptual, places where reality operated on entirely different principles. Activating the portal had long-term consequences for Gravity Falls. The breach it created, even when later closed, had weakened the barriers between dimensions in the local area. This made Gravity Falls a place where reality was more flexible, where entities from other dimensions found it easier to slip through, appearing briefly before natural forces pushed them back. The portal's energy signature also appeared to attract Bill Cipher's attention, as the demon recognized an opportunity to use the dimensional weakness for its own purposes. Human consciousness proved particularly vulnerable to dimensional interference. Minds could be pulled partially into other realms, creating experiences that felt like dreams, but were actually visits to real places. People affected this way often had trouble distinguishing memory from imagination afterward, carrying back impressions of impossible geometries and colors that did not exist in normal spectrum. Some developed abilities as a result, minor psychic powers, or enhanced intuition. Side effects of their minds being exposed to dimensions where thought and matter were more closely linked. The manipulation of memory emerged as a significant phenomenon in Gravity Falls. A secret society known as the Society of the Blind Eye operated for years with the specific purpose of erasing memories of supernatural encounters. They used a device, a memory gun, that could target specific recollections and remove them entirely. The technology's origins were unclear, seemingly too advanced for the era in which it appeared. When fired at a person, the gun created a flash of light, and afterward the target would have gaps in their memory, missing the experiences the society deemed too dangerous or disturbing to retain. The society believed they were protecting people, operating under the philosophy that ignorance of the supernatural led to happier lives than awareness did. They sought out anyone who had witnessed something impossible and offered to erase those memories, allowing people to return to normal lives free from fear and confusion. However, memory proved more interconnected than the society realized. Removing one memory affected others linked to it, sometimes creating cascading amnesia that could leave someone fundamentally changed. People who received multiple memory wipes became increasingly disconnected from their own past, their personalities fragmenting as more of their history disappeared. The memory gun's effects could be reversed under the right conditions: strong emotional connections, repeated exposure to reminders, and sometimes simply the passage of time would allow memories to resurface partially. The brain tried to heal itself, filling in gaps with constructions that might not match what originally happened, but were close enough to restore continuity. Some people recovered fully from memory wipes, while others never quite managed to reclaim what was taken. One individual, Fiddleford McGucket, suffered particularly from memory erasure. After experiencing traumatic events related to paranormal research, he used the memory gun on himself repeatedly. Eventually, he founded the Society of the Blind Eye itself, creating an organization to make memory erasure available to others who wanted to forget. This tragic loop occurred because each time fragments of his memories returned, the trauma drove him to erase them again. His mind became a patchwork of fragments and gaps, barely holding together a sense of identity. When his memories were eventually restored through exposure to the original experiences and careful reconstruction, the process was difficult and incomplete, leaving him changed, but at least aware of his own history. Consciousness transfer represented an even more invasive manipulation than memory erasure. Through deals made in the mindscape, Bill Cipher could possess human bodies, taking complete control while the original consciousness was suppressed or trapped as a passive observer. When Bill made such a deal and took over a body, it piloted the person like a vehicle, with the demon's personality replacing the victim's own behavior. The possession was not perfect. Bill's mannerisms and way of speaking leaked through despite attempts at mimicry, creating a disturbing effect where familiar people acted wrong in subtle but noticeable ways. Breaking such possession required either Bill voluntarily leaving the body or using the memory gun to erase the mind it inhabited. This second option was extreme, effectively destroying the person's consciousness to remove the demon's hold. However, the fundamental pattern of identity proved resilient enough that with help, an erased person could rebuild themselves using context clues and relationships with others who remembered them. The process was never complete, and the person was never quite the same, but it offered a chance to exist again after what should have been total destruction. The culmination of all these paranormal threads came during an event that would be known as Weirdmageddon. This was when Bill Cipher finally achieved its goal of breaking through from the mindscape into physical reality. The entity gained access through a dimensional rift that had been created as a side effect of the portal's operation. When Bill crossed over completely, it brought with it an apocalyptic transformation of Gravity Falls. The sky shattered into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and geometric patterns. Creatures from nightmares and other dimensions flooded into the physical world. The town was thrown into surreal chaos, where the laws of physics became mere suggestions that Bill could override at will. Bill established a throne in the center of town, a massive pyramid of its own design that floated in defiance of gravity. From there, it remade reality according to whim, transforming people into objects or living paintings or twisted versions of themselves. Buildings contorted into impossible configurations, streets looped back on themselves, and the sky displayed constantly shifting nightmarish imagery. The natural world recoiled, with animals fleeing the affected area or transforming into monstrous versions of themselves under the influence of Bill's power. Refugees who survived the initial transformation huddled in protected areas, spaces where enough willpower and belief in reality held the chaos at bay. These safe zones were fragile, requiring constant maintenance through shared certainty about what was real and what was demon-born illusion. The demons sent creatures to probe these defenses, testing the resolve of those inside, looking for doubts it could exploit to breach the barriers. Among the demon servants were beings from countless dimensions. These were creatures that existed outside normal reality, entities made of pure mathematics or living concepts or fragments of dead universes. They varied in size from microscopic to building-sized, in shape from spheres to recursive fractals. Some were malevolent, delighting in the suffering they caused. Others were simply alien, following their own logic that had nothing to do with human concerns. All were dangerous, because reality itself was their plaything during this period. The physical form the demon chose for itself in the real world was larger than its mental projection, a massive pyramid hundreds of feet tall. It had grown arms and legs made of brick, and its eye could fire beams of energy that transmuted matter or erased it entirely. This body was nearly invincible, regenerating from damage almost instantly and immune to conventional harm. It walked through Gravity Falls like a god, reshaping everything it touched. Defeating such a being required thinking beyond physical combat. Bill's power came from existing in the physical world, but its consciousness remained fundamentally tied to the mindscape. The solution involved trapping Bill inside a human mind, and then using the memory gun to erase that mind completely, destroying Bill in the process. This required Stanley Pines to sacrifice his own memories, allowing Bill to enter what the demon thought was Stanford's mind, only to discover too late that it had been tricked. When the memory gun was fired, it erased Stan's consciousness, and Bill along with it, ending Weirdmageddon, but at the cost of Stan's entire identity and personal history. When Bill was destroyed, Weirdmageddon ended suddenly. Reality snapped back like a rubber band released, correcting itself rapidly. Buildings returned to their original positions, people transformed back to human form, and the laws of physics reasserted themselves firmly. But Stanley Pines remained without his memories, not knowing who he was or recognizing anyone around him. The memory gun's effects proved not completely irreversible. Through exposure to personal items, photographs, and most importantly, the emotional connections with his family, fragments of Stan's identity began returning. The process was gradual and required the help of those who knew him. But eventually, enough memories surfaced that Stan regained himself, though the experience left him changed and with some permanent gaps in his recollection. The town's memory of Weirdmageddon was spotty. Many people convinced themselves it had been a shared hallucination, a town-wide delusion brought on by contaminated water or mass hysteria. Others remembered clearly but chose not to speak about it, aware that discussing the impossible only made others uncomfortable. A few embraced what had happened, seeing it as proof that reality was more flexible than anyone admitted, and becoming seekers of further strangeness. Physical evidence of the event persisted despite attempts to rationalize it away. Buildings showed damage that could not be explained by conventional means, walls bent in directions that should not be possible, and marks burned into pavement in geometric patterns that matched the demon's form. The forest contained areas where time still ran slightly wrong, minutes passing faster or slower than they should. These temporal scars gradually healed, normalizing over months and years, but they served as reminders that something profound had happened. In the aftermath, documentation of paranormal events became more systematic. The journals that had been created by the original researcher were recovered and expanded. New volumes added to catalog everything that had occurred. These new journals included theories about why gravity falls was as it was, hypotheses about the dimensional weaknesses and temporal anomalies that made the town special. They became guides for those who stayed or visited, warnings about what to avoid, and how to recognize when reality was bending. Certain locations in and around the town developed reputations as hotspots for ongoing paranormal activity. A particular meadow where mushrooms grew in impossible spirals became known as a place where wishes sometimes came true, though never in expected ways. A stretch of road experienced chronic problems with hitchhiking ghosts, spirits that would appear suddenly in the road and cause drivers to swerve. A specific tree in the forest bled sap that glowed and hummed, attracting pilgrims seeking mystical experiences. The natives who had originally inhabited the area before settlers arrived left behind more than just symbols. Structures remained buried, monuments to beliefs and practices that modern archaeology struggled to categorize. Some of these were clearly ceremonial, places where rituals tied to the solstices had been performed. Others seemed designed to contain or channel the energy that permeated the area, focusing it for purposes that could only be guessed. Excavations revealed layers of civilization stretching back impossibly far, suggesting the location had been significant for thousands of years. One monument in particular captured attention. It was a circle of standing stones, not as large as some famous megalithic sites, but perfectly preserved and clearly intentional. The stones had been arranged to align with certain stars, but the alignment was to star positions from over 10,000 years ago, when the sky looked different due to precession. This indicated the circle was either far older than carbon dating suggested, or had been built by people with astronomical knowledge beyond what their technology level should have allowed. The stone circle functioned as a focal point for temporal energy. During certain times of year, particularly the equinoxes, the area within the circle experienced time differently than the surrounding space. This was measurable with careful instrumentation, clocks running minutes fast or slow compared to controls placed just outside the circle. People who stood within during these active periods reported visions, seeing past or future or parallel possibilities played out like scenes from a film. These visions were not always clear. Many were symbolic, dreamlike sequences that required interpretation. Others were viscerally real, placing the viewer directly into another time as if they had actually traveled there. A person might find themselves standing in the same spot, but hundreds of years earlier, watching as events unfolded around them. They could not interact with these scenes, existing as invisible observers, but the experience left lasting impressions and sometimes valuable information. The indigenous people's relationship with the paranormal had been one of balance rather than control. They did not seek to eliminate or exploit the strangeness, but rather to coexist with it respectfully. Their ceremonies included offerings to spirits, acknowledgments of the unseen forces that influenced their lives. They mapped the dangerous areas and taught their children to recognize signs of supernatural presence. This wisdom was largely lost when their culture was disrupted, though fragments survived in stories and place names. Modern attempts to apply scientific method to gravity falls phenomena met with mixed success. Equipment functioned unreliably, theories that worked elsewhere failed here, and repeatability, the cornerstone of science, proved elusive. What worked one day might not work the next. Creatures that appeared regularly might vanish for months. The very act of observation seemed to influence outcomes, as if reality responded to being watched. Some researchers theorized that consciousness itself played a role in shaping the paranormal activity. Where people believed strongly in certain phenomena, those phenomena manifested more readily. A community expecting ghosts would experience more hauntings. This did not mean the events were imaginary, but rather that expectations somehow made reality more malleable, more willing to accommodate the impossible. Gravity Falls, with its long history of strange events, carried collective belief that empowered further strangeness. The question of why Gravity Falls specifically remained central. Geography provided partial answers. The valley's shape created unusual wind patterns and microclimates. Mineral deposits in the bedrock included rare elements with unusual properties. Underground water flows followed paths that suggested ancient engineering. But these physical factors alone could not explain everything. There had to be something more, some quality or purpose to the location that transcended material causes. One theory proposed that Gravity Falls existed at a node in some kind of planetary or cosmic grid, a network of power points that spanned the world or perhaps the universe. These nodes were places where the fabric of reality was naturally thinner, where dimensions pressed close together and energy flowed more freely. If such a grid existed, it would explain why so many disparate phenomena clustered in one small area. It would also suggest that other nodes existed elsewhere, other towns or regions with their own unique flavor of strangeness. The concept of ley lines featured in discussions, despite its controversial status in mainstream science. Proponents argued that Gravity Falls sat at the intersection of multiple ley lines, channels through which Earth energy flowed. This energy supposedly powered magic, attracted supernatural beings, and created conditions favorable to paranormal events. Skeptics pointed out the lack of measurable evidence for ley lines, but in a place where so much defied measurement, dismissing the theory felt premature. Historical records showed that knowledge of Gravity Falls' special nature had been suppressed repeatedly over the years. Newspapers from the early 20th century contained articles about strange phenomena that were later retracted or explained away. Government agencies had investigated multiple times, arriving with equipment and personnel, then departing weeks later with sealed reports that were classified. This pattern of discovery and concealment suggested powerful interests preferred to keep the town's secrets quiet. The question of motive for this secrecy had multiple answers. Some believed the government sought to monopolize paranormal phenomena for military or intelligence purposes. Others thought certain wealthy families worked to protect their own interests, perhaps having made deals with entities that required discretion. A more benign interpretation suggested that authorities simply feared mass panic, believing public knowledge of the supernatural would cause more harm than good. Individuals who learned too much about Gravity Falls often found themselves encouraged to leave or to forget. Subtle pressures built up, job offers elsewhere, family emergencies that required relocation, or in extreme cases, interventions by the society dedicated to erasing memories. This created a self-selecting population in the town, people who either remained ignorant or who chose to stay, despite knowing the risks. Both groups contributed to the town's peculiar character, the willful blindness of some balanced by the determined awareness of others. Children proved particularly susceptible to perceiving the paranormal, their minds more flexible and less constrained by expectations of normality. They saw things adults missed, creatures hiding in plain sight that faded from view when grown-ups looked. This childhood sensitivity usually faded with age, but not always completely. Some adults retained traces of their youthful openness, becoming the local experts on the weird and serving as guides for others who stumbled into strangeness. The educational system in Gravity Falls faced unique challenges. How did teachers explain historical events that had been influenced by the supernatural without discussing the supernatural itself? The curriculum included coded references, lessons about local legends that contained kernels of truth buried in embellishment. Students who paid attention could piece together that something unusual was going on, though most were too busy with ordinary concerns to notice. A few educators embraced their role as informal initiators into the mysteries. These teachers dropped hints, assigned research projects that led students toward discovery, and provided reading lists that included obscure texts on folklore and paranormal investigation. They walked a fine line, never explicitly confirming anything, but creating opportunities for learning that extended beyond standard subjects. Some former students returned years later to thank these teachers for opening their eyes. The local library served as a nexus of knowledge about Gravity Falls history and mysteries. Its collection included rare books, donated papers from deceased researchers, and files maintained by generations of librarians who understood their role as keepers of secrets. Accessing this material required knowing what to ask for, as the most valuable items were not cataloged in the public system. A patron who demonstrated genuine interest and discretion might be led to the special archive, a basement room where the truth waited on dusty shelves. This special collection contained journals beyond those famous three. Dozens of researchers over the decades had documented their findings, some scientific and measured, others veering into occult speculation. Reading through them revealed patterns, phenomena that appeared and disappeared cyclically, creatures whose behavior had remained consistent over a century. It also showed dead ends, investigations that went nowhere, or that ended abruptly when the researcher vanished or gave up. Personal accounts from townspeople added texture to the scholarly work. Letters and diaries described encounters in plain language, fear and wonder mixing with the mundane details of daily life. One farmer wrote about watching his cattle talk to each other on a particular full moon, their voices deep and discussing incomprehensible topics until dawn came and they returned to normal. Another resident documented a week where gravity failed in her house, furniture floating ceilingward until the effect mysteriously ceased. These personal testimonies often contradicted each other or described impossibilities that even by Gravity Falls standards seemed unlikely. But taken as a whole, they painted a picture of a community that had learned to adapt. People took precautions, avoided certain areas at certain times, and developed folk wisdom about dealing with the supernatural. Don't whistle at night in the forest. Never count the eyes on a creature before you see its mouth. Always thank the gnomes when they move your garden tools. These rules had no clear origin, but they persisted because following them seemed to help. The economy of Gravity Falls had adapted to accommodate its unique situation. Tourism related to the paranormal provided significant income. The Mystery Shack and similar attractions offered sanitized versions of the town's strangeness, enough to entertain without truly revealing. Local businesses sold talismans and charms, some genuinely protective, most just clever merchandising. Real estate agents faced the interesting challenge of selling properties with supernatural histories, navigating disclosure requirements versus scaring off buyers. Certain entrepreneurs had built empires on exploiting the paranormal. One family had monopolized child psychic shows, using a combination of genuine ability and showmanship to amaze audiences. Another individual ran tours through supposedly haunted locations, carefully timing visits to avoid actual supernatural encounters while maintaining an atmosphere of mystery. These businesses existed in tension with those who thought the town's secrets should remain protected. But economic necessity often won out over discretion. Insurance companies had developed special policies for Gravity Falls. Standard coverage excluded supernatural causes, creating a niche for specialized carriers willing to insure against hauntings, creature attacks, or dimensional mishaps. The premiums were high but necessary for anyone running a business where paranormal events might cause damage. Claims adjusters who worked in the area became adept at recognizing actual supernatural causes versus normal accidents attributed to ghosts. Law enforcement in Gravity Falls occupied an unusual position. Officers had to decide when to investigate reports of the impossible and when to dismiss them. The department maintained unofficial files on recurring phenomena, places and times when extra patrols might prevent problems. Deputies learned to recognize the signs of real supernatural encounters versus pranks or misunderstandings. They also developed relationships with local experts, people they could call when something arose that required specialized knowledge. The challenge was maintaining public order while acknowledging that some crimes fell outside normal categories. How did you charge someone whose mind had been possessed during their actions? What constituted self-defense against a creature that did not officially exist? The legal system had not evolved to handle these situations, forcing officers to improvise and often settle matters informally. This created inconsistency, but also flexibility, allowing outcomes that served justice, even if they did not follow procedure. Medical professionals faced similar complications. Injuries and illnesses caused by supernatural means sometimes responded to conventional treatment, sometimes required unorthodox approaches. Doctors learned to ask careful questions about how injuries occurred, reading between the lines of patient answers. The local hospital maintained a consultation relationship with individuals knowledgeable about folklore and mysticism, recognizing that some conditions required thinking beyond standard medical model. Mental health in particular presented challenges. How did therapists distinguish genuine psychological conditions from rational reactions to experiencing the impossible? Patients who claim to have seen monsters or experienced time travel might be delusional or might be telling the truth. Careful evaluation became crucial, as misdiagnosis could leave someone untreated or could invalidate real experiences and cause further trauma. The town developed a culture of mutual aid around dealing with the paranormal. Neighbors looked out for each other, sharing information about recent strange events and offering help when someone was affected. This community support network operated outside official channels, a loose collective of people who understood that strangeness was part of life here and worked together to minimize harm. Someone whose house was haunted could count on others arriving with salt, sage, and experience. Religious institutions in Gravity Falls took varied approaches to the supernatural. Some churches incorporated it into their theology, viewing demons and spirits as biblical forces active in the world. Others maintained that true faith protected believers, that the paranormal held no power over the righteous. A few religious leaders denied the supernatural entirely, insisting all such reports were delusion or deception. This diversity reflected broader human uncertainty about how the spiritual and paranormal related. One small congregation had formed specifically around the idea that Gravity Falls was a sacred place, chosen by higher powers as a testing ground or meeting point between realms. They performed ceremonies meant to honor the spirits of the land and to maintain balance between forces. Whether their efforts accomplished anything was debatable, but their sincere reverence for the mystery provided comfort to those who needed to believe the chaos had purpose. The philosophical implications of living in a place where the impossible regularly occurred forced residents to reconsider basic assumptions about reality. If magic existed, what did that mean for science? If consciousness could transfer between bodies, what was the nature of self? If time could be manipulated, did free will exist? These were not abstract questions, but practical considerations that affected how people understood their lives. Some embraced the uncertainty, finding freedom in knowing that reality was more flexible than they had been taught. They experimented with boundaries, testing what was possible, sometimes successfully bending small rules through will and belief. Others found the lack of firm ground disturbing, clinging more tightly to rationality as a defense against chaos. The tension between these approaches created interesting community dynamics, philosophical debates playing out in town halls and diners. Artists drawn to Gravity Falls found inspiration in its strangeness. Painters captured scenes that could not exist. Musicians composed pieces incorporating sounds heard from interdimensional sources. And writers crafted stories that drew from real events while changing names and details. This creative output served multiple purposes: processing trauma through art, preserving memories of events that might otherwise be forgotten, and communicating truths that could not be spoken plainly. The town's art reflected layers of history, indigenous works, settler documentation, and modern interpretations all existing together. Murals on building walls depicted local legends with such specificity that they served as maps to paranormal sites. Sculptures in parks incorporated symbols whose meanings had been recorded in hidden journals. Even street names and business signage sometimes contained encoded references, inside jokes for those aware enough to catch them. Music in Gravity Falls had its own peculiarities. Certain melodies, when played in specific locations, could trigger effects, doors opening, weather changing, or emotions surging unnaturally. This was not reproducible, The same song played elsewhere or at different times had no power, but the occasional success suggested connections between sound, intention, and reality. Local musicians experimented with these effects, creating pieces designed to invoke particular responses with varying results. The concept of sacred spaces appeared repeatedly in analysis of gravity falls. Places where the veil between worlds was thin did not just enable supernatural events, they demanded respect. Approaching them with proper reverence seemed to make encounters safer, while bringing mockery or greed invited punishment. This suggested the paranormal entities had agency and values, responding not just to actions, but to intentions. Some locations could be claimed through ritual. Performing certain ceremonies, often involving offerings of food or symbolic items, established a relationship between person and place. Once claimed, that space became safer for the claimant, as if the local spirits recognized and protected them. But claims could be violated by others performing counterclaims, leading to supernatural disputes resolved through contests or negotiations that involved the living and the not quite living. The forest itself seemed to have will, impossible as that sounded. It directed animals in ways that resembled thought, created paths that appeared when needed and vanished after use, and occasionally isolated areas to prevent intrusion. People who spent long periods in the deep woods reported feeling observed constantly, a sensation of vast attention focused on them. Some found this comforting, others terrifying. But all agreed the forest was active in ways that transcended normal ecology. Seasonal variations affected paranormal activity. Spring brought surges as energy from winter dormancy released. Summer saw stabilization. Phenomena became predictable and tourists safe. Autumn increased intensity again as the year prepared for endings. Spirits grew restless, and creatures became aggressive stocking food for winter. Winter brought a different quality, stillness and waiting, with occasional bursts of activity around the solstices when day and night balanced briefly before tipping. The solstices themselves were crucial times. Forces held at bay for months gained temporary freedom during the long night or endless day. The summer solstice saw increased fairy activity, if fairies were the right word for the mercurial beings that appeared. The winter solstice brought ghosts, many ghosts, as if the thin veil thickened briefly and spirits rushed through before it sealed again. Rituals performed at these times carried extra weight, spells cast at solstice having power beyond normal attempts. Eclipses created their own category of temporal anomaly. When the moon blocked the sun or the earth shadowed the moon, gravity falls experienced overlaps, brief moments when other dimensions became visible. People reported seeing landscapes superimposed over familiar streets, alien geometries flickering in and out of perception. These visions faded when the eclipse ended, but they provided glimpses of the vast multiverse surrounding normal reality. Weather in Gravity Falls followed patterns but with quirks. Rain sometimes fell upward, drops ascending from ground to sky. Fog occasionally arrived with intelligence, moving purposefully and avoiding certain areas. Thunder could form words if you listened carefully, though understanding those words was dangerous, knowledge best not known. Local meteorologists learned to predict normal weather accurately, but gave up trying to forecast the supernatural variations. The electromagnetic environment of the area showed unusual readings. Compass needles did not point true north, but instead oriented towards something else, possibly the location of dimensional weaknesses. Cell phones and radios picked up transmissions from sources that should not exist. Number stations broadcasting data for unknown purposes. Electrical equipment generally worked, but occasionally displayed impossible readings, more power output than input, or devices turning on without apparent energy source. These electromagnetic anomalies attracted researchers hoping to find measurable explanations for the paranormal. If they could identify what made gravity falls different in terms of fields and frequencies, perhaps they could replicate or neutralize the effects. But measurements consistently revealed that the strangeness came before the electromagnetic oddities, not after. The unusual readings were symptoms, not causes. Gravity itself behaved variably. The town's name came from observed gravitational irregularities, places where objects fell slower or faster than they should. These gravity wells and peaks moved over time, creating hazards for the unwary. Someone might step into an area of increased gravity and suddenly weigh double, struggling to move until they stumbled back out. Conversely, light gravity zones allowed impossible jumps and threatened to float people away if they did not anchor themselves. The question of intelligent design versus natural formation persisted through all analysis. Had someone or something deliberately created gravity falls as it was, shaping a location for specific purposes? Or had natural processes, however exotic, simply created unusual conditions that attracted and enabled paranormal phenomena? Both theories had support. Neither was provable with available evidence. If the town was designed, the architect remained unknown. Candidates ranged from ancient human civilizations with lost knowledge, to alien visitors who left installations, to interdimensional beings who required anchor points in multiple realities. Each possibility carried implications about humanity's place in a much larger cosmos, about what secrets might be waiting in other locations around the world. If the conditions were natural, the implications were equally profound. It suggested that reality was far stranger than consensus reality acknowledged, that the universe contained pockets of genuine magic, or at least exotic physics that enabled magic-like effects. It opened possibilities for discovering or creating similar conditions elsewhere, for expanding human understanding and capability in directions science fiction barely imagined. Gravity Falls served as a reminder that mystery persisted. In an age where information was supposed to be readily available, where satellite imagery mapped every surface and internet connected all knowledge, places still existed that resisted complete understanding. The town held secrets that might never be fully revealed, questions that could not be answered with current methods or mindsets. Those who spent time in Gravity Falls and truly engaged with its mysteries often came away changed. Not just in terms of believing the impossible, though that was part of it, but in their fundamental relationship with reality. They learned to hold certainty lightly, to accept that what seemed true today might prove false tomorrow. They developed comfort with not knowing, with living in tension between explanation and wonder. The children who grew up in Gravity Falls especially carried this flexibility forward. They had seen enough strangeness that adult attempts to impose rigid worldviews bounced off. They knew from experience that reality was negotiable, that will and belief could affect outcomes, and that magic in various forms was real. What they would do with this knowledge as they aged, and potentially spread it to less informed areas, remained to be seen. Some who left Gravity Falls found the outside world disappointingly mundane. Having experienced genuine wonder and terror, ordinary life felt flat. They sometimes returned, unable to adapt to places where the impossible did not intrude. Others took their experiences as inoculation against future strangeness, knowing whatever they encountered elsewhere could not exceed what they had already survived. The town itself seemed to know about its role in nature. Streets arranged themselves in patterns that encoded information for those who could read them. Buildings hosted spirits that acted as guardians and teachers. The very land responded to how it was treated, flourishing when respected, becoming hostile when abused. Whether this was consciousness in any human sense was questionable, but it resembled something close enough to deserve consideration. As years passed after the major paranormal events, Gravity Falls settled into a new equilibrium. The activity never stopped entirely, but it stabilized at manageable levels. People adapted, incorporating the supernatural into their routines. Children walked to school past houses that were slightly haunted. Adults commuted past clearings where time ran funny. Life continued because humans are remarkably adaptable when necessary. The documentation of events continued, new journals filling with observations and theories. Each generation of researchers added their perspectives, building on what came before while occasionally overturning old assumptions. The accumulated knowledge formed a unique archive. Nowhere else had such detailed records of sustained paranormal activity over decades. Visitors to Gravity Falls came seeking different things. Some wanted proof of the supernatural for themselves. Others hoped to debunk claims and demonstrate everything had rational explanations. A few came looking for power, believing access to paranormal phenomena could give them advantages. Most found what they sought, as gravity. Falls had a way of showing people what they were prepared to see. The town's future remained uncertain. Would the paranormal activity eventually fade as dimensional barriers strengthened and the portal's effects healed fully? Would new incidents occur, perhaps attracting attention that could not be deflected? Or would Gravity Falls continue indefinitely as it had, a pocket of strangeness in a world that mostly preferred normality? No prediction was safe when dealing with a place that defied predictions by nature. What was certain was that Gravity Falls had earned its place in the hidden history of paranormal events. The sheer concentration and variety of phenomena documented there made it unique. From gnomes to demons, from time travel to consciousness transfer, from harmless weirdness to apocalyptic threats, the town had experienced seemingly everything the supernatural had to offer. And it had survived, adapted, and kept most of its secrets. The people of Gravity Falls carried forward with quiet pride. They knew their town was special, even if they could not always explain why. They looked at visitors who saw only a small tourist trap with amusement, aware of layers upon layers of reality tourists never glimpsed. They protected the children, taught them the unspoken rules, and passed down stories that served as both entertainment and warning. In the end, Gravity Falls represented possibility. It proved that reality contained more than mainstream science acknowledged. It demonstrated that human understanding remained incomplete. It kept alive the idea that mystery and magic, terror and wonder, still existed in a world that too often claimed all frontiers had been mapped. And perhaps that was its greatest gift, the reminder that some things should stay mysterious, that not everything needed explanation, and that the universe was far stranger and more beautiful than anyone fully understood. The paranormal events that occurred in Gravity Falls formed a tapestry of interconnected strangeness, each thread contributing to a larger pattern. The gnomes and their underground kingdoms, the lake monsters, both real and mechanical, the ghosts with their unfinished business, the shapeshifters and their deceptions, the time anomalies and consciousness transfers, the dream demon and its apocalyptic ambitions, all of these were pieces of something greater. Whether that something was chaos or design, natural or artificial, benign or hostile, remained open to interpretation. What mattered most was that Gravity Falls endured. The town that sat in a valley surrounded by whispering pines continued its existence, strange and wonderful, and occasionally terrifying, but always itself. The paranormal activity that defined it showed no signs of stopping, only shifting, adapting, finding new forms and expressions. And somewhere in the forest, in a clearing where mushrooms glowed and time ran strangely, the mysteries waited patiently for the next person curious enough to look beneath the surface. The summer sun sets behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Gravity Falls. The town grows quiet as night approaches, though never truly silent. In the darkness between the trees, things move and watch. In the spaces between moments, other realities press close. And in the minds of those who know the truth, the paranormal events continue, will always continue, woven into the very fabric of this strange and secret place. The mysteries remain, comforting in their persistence, reminding all who pause to notice that wonder still exists for those willing to seek it, and that some questions are more valuable than any answer could ever be.